Cold wind dragged across the open fields of northeastern France, carrying the scent of burned timber and frozen soil. The leaves had already fallen, leaving trees as silent witnesses to a war that was supposed to be decisive. But the war was ending differently than promised. And inside a broken signal station near Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, 4 young women in Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms sat huddled near a fallen beam. Listening to artillery they could no longer map or report, waiting for orders that would never come. Their names were Ilse, Greta, Margot, and Lenny, though in those days, names were secondary to roles: radio assistant, telegraph operator, message courier, and signal decoder. They had entered military service not with the bravado of soldiers, but with the quiet obedience of girls raised in classrooms, where portraits of leaders hung larger than maps. They were told they served something eternal. They repeated phrases about duty and sacrifice because they had never seen a world outside their towns, their barracks, their training camps. They believed the war touched them distantly, like storms glimpsed from behind windows. Ilse, once a schoolgirl who ran races in spring fields, now limped permanently. Shrapnel from an Allied bombing raid had torn through the communications van she was working inside 3 months earlier, embedding metal deep into her knee. Army doctors saved the leg but left her with pain sharp enough to reshape her stride forever. Greta's right eye had been partially blinded by an explosion during a withdrawal from an overrun position. The flash of light had been so sudden that she had not realized what happened until her world narrowed to blurs and shadows. Margot bore no physical wounds, but her laughter had vanished. And Lenny, youngest of them, still carried childhood softness in her voice, though day by day it thinned. Now the 4 women sat in silence, waiting. They did not know what else to do. The commanding officer had fled hours earlier. Nobody had told them whether to stay, to run, to fight, or to surrender. Wires they once used to route orders were cut. Radios were dead. The world had gone quiet except for distant shelling. Margot, the most talkative among them in better days, whispered, "Do you think they will kill us?" No one answered. They had been taught many things about Americans. That they were vulgar, violent, that they treated prisoners like animals, that they had no honor, no discipline, no morality. Propaganda films had shown them American soldiers drinking openly, laughing crudely, pushing German prisoners into mud. The message had been clear. Surrender meant losing not just one's life but one's dignity. Lenny, 19, held her hand so tightly in her lap that her knuckles whitened. She had grown up in Bavaria, where loyalty was expected. Even now she tried to hold faith. "Maybe we will be sent back behind German lines," she said. Though everyone knew German lines were gone, Ilse closed her eyes. Pain radiated through her leg. The idea of marching anywhere felt like mockery carved into bone. The shelling stopped, and in the quiet that followed they heard something unmistakable. Engines. Trucks. Many of them. Greta leaned toward a crack in the collapsed wall. Vehicles approaching were olive drab, not gray. Stars painted on their hoods. The realization arrived slow, like ice spreading through cold water. The Americans were here. The women rose as best they could, hands trembling. There was nowhere to hide. The building was half collapsed, the field outside bare except for equipment charred and twisted beyond use. Ilse struggled for balance, and Margot helped her stand. No one spoke. There was no plan left to speak of. The American soldiers approached with rifles at the ready. The women lifted their hands. The gesture felt enormous, surrendering not just their bodies but the story they had been told about themselves. For a long second, nothing happened. Then one of the Americans, a young man with a soft face, as startled as they were, lowered his weapon. He said something none of them understood, but the tone was calm. He motioned for them to step forward. A medic moved in immediately. Before questions, before interrogation, before verifying identity, he examined Ilse's leg. His hands were steady, practiced. He had seen wounds like this before. Ilse stared, bewildered. She had imagined an enemy full of cruelty. Yet this man's touch held only routine care, the kind given to a patient. "They're just treating us," Greta murmured. The Americans offered blankets, water. One soldier took off his coat and placed it over Lenny's shoulders when she shivered. The women exchanged glances, not of relief, not yet, but of stunned confusion. They expected to be yelled at, mocked, pushed. But the Americans were quiet, focused, professional, almost wary, as though the presence of female prisoners required caution rather than power. Hours passed in a blur. They were given transport, placed into the back of a truck with other prisoners. Men and women sat together in uneasy stillness, united now not by ideology but by the collapse of everything that had once defined them. The engine vibrated through the truck bed. The cold seeped into their bones. Ilse leaned back and stared through the canvas flap at the gray winter sky. As the convoy moved west, Ilse watched the wreckage of roads, farms, and towns slide past. So many homes burned or deserted, no flags flying, no signs of victory for anyone. Just ruin. At a temporary holding station, an American officer explained they would not remain in Europe. They were being processed for transport to the United States under the Geneva Convention. They were being taken across the ocean. Across the ocean, to the land of the enemy. Not as spoils, not as slaves, but as prisoners with rights. A storm of emotion passed through them. Fear, disbelief, a muted flicker of reluctant hope. None of these feelings felt safe to hold. Lenny whispered, "America," the word barely forming. It sounded like myth. Greta closed her eye and tried to steady herself. Her world had ended several times already. This felt like another ending. Or perhaps a beginning disguised in surrender. Ilsa looked down at her injured leg and imagined stepping onto a ship, crossing a vast ocean she had only seen on school maps. The uncertainty ahead was immense, but the fear of brutality, the thing that had haunted them, was shifting into something else. A question. What if everything they had been taught about the enemy had been wrong? The truck started again. Behind them, Europe burned. Ahead lay an unknown world, one that would challenge every belief they had carried into the war. A damp cold hung over the harbor as dawn broke, a light too pale to warm anyone. The women were herded from the railcars one by one, their boots clanking against the metal ramp leading toward the ship that would take them west. They moved slowly, Ilsa leaning heavily on a cane fashioned from a shortened tent pole. Greta walked with her head slightly tilted, her good eye straining to take in everything at once. Margot and Lenny followed close behind, close enough to touch if the fear of appearing weak did not still linger in their bones. The ship waiting for them was a U.S. Liberty vessel, industrial and massive, its hull coated in chipped gray paint and salt. Engines hummed with a low growl. American guards stood by the gangway, rifles slung but not raised. The women's hearts beat unevenly, uncertain of what awaited them on the other side of that steel threshold. A soldier checked their names against a clipboard. Not one insult, not one threat, just numbers, dates, and procedural monotony. They had expected humiliation, perhaps harsh laughter. Instead, the Americans treated them with the impersonal thoroughness of workers handling cargo. It was not kindness exactly, but its neutrality was its own shock. The absence of cruelty was louder than any words. When they stepped aboard, the scent of fuel, sea air, and machine grease enveloped them. The deck shuddered with the constant vibration of engines. Beneath them was an Atlantic still holding winter's bite. They were not alone. Hundreds of German POWs, mostly men, were already aboard, wearing expressions ranging from blank defeat to quiet calculation. The women were separated by a rope partition and escorted to a small enclosed cabin repurposed into a temporary female ward. It held cots bolted to the floor and blankets rough enough to scrape skin. Ilsa eased herself down, the pain in her knee sharp and familiar. Greta sat beside her, pressing a hand to her temple to fight the ache brought on by long travel and the strain of seeing the world through half a field of vision. Laney perched on the edge of a cot as though afraid she would sink straight through the ship into the sea. Margot exhaled only when she saw they were not locked in. The door closed, but it did not latch. The voyage began with a low horn that rolled through the air like thunder, echoing across the water. The shoreline receded. Europe, with its shattered cities and starving towns, became a silhouette, then a memory blurred by salt spray. That coastline had been everything they knew. None of the women spoke for a long time. They listened to boots on metal, distant orders shouted in English, and the constant thrum of engines pushing them farther from the life they once belonged to. Lenny pressed her face to a porthole. All she saw was ocean, gray, endless, indifferent. On the second day, seasickness hit half the prisoners with brutal efficiency. Lenny clutched a tin bucket while Margot rubbed slow circles on her back with tired hands. Ilsa braced herself against the bulkhead, head bowed, breathing through waves of nausea that came with deep stabbing pain in her leg. Greta could not bear the shifting brightness outside the small oval window. The reflection of sunlight on waves disoriented her limited sight. Yet through all of it, the guards behaved with a kind of weary patience. They distributed water without complaint. They opened hatches for fresh air. One medic checked Ilsa's knee again, tightening the bandage with practiced clarity. He said little, did not smile, did not scowl, just ensured infection did not set in. Margot found herself studying him. She had expected Americans to look fierce or smug or triumphant. Instead, most looked exhausted, like men who had seen more than they had ever wanted to. It was a subtle shock, one she could not yet name. They were not monsters. They were just men trying to get through another day. Meals were plain and repetitive, white bread, thin soup, black coffee that tasted burned. Nothing luxurious but enough to keep hunger at bay. The women ate side by side with other female prisoners captured elsewhere along the European front. A typist from Hamburg, a meteorological aide from Bremen, a switchboard technician from Vienna who refused to speak at all. They were joined not by politics but by displacement, by the disorienting knowledge that the war had shifted direction without consulting them. They were no longer part of something grand. They were pieces swept ahead by events too large to grasp. At night, the ship creaked with the movements of waves. The ocean was a living thing, vast, unbound, and older than any nation telling its daughters what to believe. Ilse lay awake, listening. In the darkness, she remembered the speeches, the banners, the certainty. Now, with every mile of water beneath them, it felt as though those once immovable truths dissolved grain by grain, like sand slipping from a grasp. She felt grief for the world she was leaving behind, but also something else, something quiet and frightening to name. Curiosity. 3 days into the journey, a mild storm hit. The ship's lights flickered as waves slapped the hull. Prisoners gripped railings and cots. Ilse clung to her cane, muscles shaking as she tried to stay upright. Greta closed her eyes to steady her balance. Americans moved through the corridors, securing storage crates and calming panic where they found it. One guard handed Lenny a second blanket when the cold wind seeped through a seam in the hull. He did not look at her long enough to make the gesture seem personal. He simply saw a shivering girl and acted. That simplicity struck her harder than any ideology. When the storm passed, skies cleared to a gentle blue. Prisoners were allowed on the main deck in small supervised groups to breathe. Standing there, the women looked out over water stretching to infinity. No battle smoke. No ruined towns. No sound except wind and waves. The war felt impossibly distant, like something happening in another lifetime. The space allowed them to think, truly think, about the contradiction forming in their minds. They had been told the enemy was depraved. They had been told surrender meant degradation, yet here they were, treated with clinical care, fed, sheltered, not touched with violence. The realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It came slowly, like dawn creeping along a horizon, a sense of disorientation, not yet trust, but the beginning of doubt. By the 6th day, land appeared, a wide stretch of shoreline lined with cranes, warehouses, and train yards unscarred by bombings. Everything looked intact, organized, alive. It was America, industrial, unbroken, enormous. The scale of it stunned them. They were unloaded onto the dock with caution but without anger. They were processed, tagged, counted, passed through a checkpoint where medical officers reevaluated injuries, and then a new order was given. Due to their wounded status and non-combat roles, they would not be placed in standard labor camps. They were being transferred inland to a U.S. Army POW hospital facility in the Midwest, stateside, far from any conflict zone. The women stared at one another. A hospital, not a prison in the brutal sense. A place built for healing. The idea felt impossible, unreal. Ilse tightened her grip on her cane. Greta blinked, focusing hard as though trying to see America clearly for the first time. Lenny's lips parted, but no words came. Margot finally whispered what they were all thinking, though she sounded almost afraid to speak it aloud. What if they are not the enemy we were told they were? The question hung in the air, weightless and heavy all at once. An unanswered truth waiting to unravel everything they believed about the world. And themselves. Morning light filtered through tall hospital windows, pale and gentle, a far cry from the gray European winters the women had known. The POW hospital sat outside a quiet Midwestern town, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon. No barbed wire towers casting shadows, no barking orders through megaphones. There were fences, yes, and guards at the gates, but the place did not feel like a battlefield's aftermath. It felt like a waiting room between worlds. The women were given cots in a shared ward where the walls smelled faintly of antiseptic and laundry soap. The linens were coarse but clean. Nurses moved through the corridors with practiced calm, their footsteps soft on polished floors. This too was unexpected. They had imagined harshness, strict discipline, cold disdain. Instead, they were greeted with something unfamiliar, routine. On their first morning, a nurse named June approached Ilse as she struggled to stand. June was young, no more than 23, with sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows and hair pinned in a careful twist. She did not speak German, but the tone of her words required no translation. She gestured gently, offering her arm for support. Ilse hesitated, pride warring with pain, but the pain won. June guided her slowly down the corridor, saying things Ilse did not understand, but in a voice that carried patience rather than command. The nurse showed her how to balance her weight, how to step forward without locking her knee. Every motion was small, precise, practiced. It was the first time since her injury that Ilse felt she was being helped to heal, rather than simply made functional. Greta's world narrowed to textures, sounds, and tones. With one eye dimmed, her depth perception faltered, and every step required caution. A sergeant assigned to ward duty noticed her hesitation and offered his arm, though he did so awkwardly, as though uncertain of the etiquette involved. He had been a schoolteacher before the war. The gentleness in his voice still held that cadence. He read aloud to her from newspapers and magazines, stopping occasionally to explain unfamiliar words. Greta listened not for the content but for the rhythm of syllables, for the way language could be soft instead of sharp. The American accent, once associated with the enemy in her mind, became something textured, almost warm. Margot watched all of this with quiet astonishment. She had learned to guard herself against vulnerability long ago. In barracks, in training, in bomb shelters, she survived by holding her emotions still. But here the stillness felt brittle. She noticed how the nurses addressed the patients by name. Every patient, not just the Americans. She noticed how they laughed among themselves without glancing over their shoulders. They moved with a freedom that felt impossible. Women in Germany had been told they served to support the men who carried the state's ambitions. Here women carried authority openly without apology. Margot did not know whether to envy it or reject it. She only knew it unsettled her. Lenny, who had grown up with hymns and village harvest festivals, found herself drawn to the chapel on the hospital grounds. The door was never locked. A chaplain, an older man with white hair and tired eyes, greeted visitors without asking where they came from or whom they prayed for. One afternoon, as Lenny sat in a pew staring at stained glass scenes of gentle blues and golds, a group of local women entered with baskets. They carried folded dresses, knitted shawls, and packages of toiletries. Their faces held grief. Deep grief, the kind shaped by telegrams and funerals, but also softness. They had lost husbands and sons to the same war the German women had been part of. Yet they came with gifts, not accusations. One woman approached Lenny and placed a wool shawl into her hands. No speech, no sermon, simply an offering given from one human being to another. Lenny's throat tightened. In that moment, she realized that suffering had carved out space for empathy, rather than hatred. And something inside her, some stone that had weighed heavily, shifted. Meals in the hospital mess hall surprised them most. The women expected to be seated separately, to be reminded constantly of their status. Instead, they were guided to a long table where American soldiers recovering from their own wounds sat beside them. Not close, not like friends, but close enough to share air and warmth. A few glanced curiously, a few stiffened, but many simply continued eating. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was cautious, fragile, but shared. The smell of boiled potatoes and broth filled the room, along with the distant sound of a radio broadcasting music that none of the women recognized. The melody was slow, wistful, almost tender. Over weeks, small interactions began to carry weight. A nurse handing Ilse a fresh bandage without judgment. The roots complicated, the priorities rearranged constantly as Europe struggled to piece itself back together. For the women, time became elastic. Days blurred into routines, therapy sessions, shared meals, quiet conversations in hallways. Their bodies healed slowly, imperfectly, but steadily. Ilse could walk now without leaning her entire weight on the cane. Greta adapted to the world with her narrowed field of vision, learning to perceive distance by sound and shadow. Margot found a stillness inside herself she had never known. Lenny prayed without words, simply by breathing, yet healing was not the same as forgetting. The women received letters from home, each stamped and censored but still heavy with the weight of a country collapsing under hunger, loss, and devastation. Towns they knew were rubble, families scattered, brothers dead or missing. The Germany described in those letters was not the Germany they remembered, and they did not know how to return to it. The Americans, too, reacted to the surrender in their own ways. Nurse June's movements grew slower, as if exhaustion had finally caught her. The chaplain spent more time in the chapel, praying quietly when he thought no one noticed. The sergeant who read to Greta was discharged and sent home. His farewell had been brief but kind. A handshake, a nod, a single sentence spoken carefully so she might understand it clearly. Take care of your sight. She had repeated the words to herself for days afterward, as she searched for meaning in those syllables that remained with her long after he was gone. One afternoon, a small group of local women came again, bringing donated clothing, books, and mended blankets. This time they stayed longer. They asked questions, gentle ones, about where the women had grown up, what their towns had been like before the war. At first, the German women answered stiffly, constrained by habit. But slowly threads of conversation formed. Lenny found herself describing the sound of church bells in her village on Easter morning. Margot talked about the orchard behind her family's house, the way apple blossoms used to fall like snow in spring. Ilse listened, noticing how the stories made their voices softer. Greta spoke less, but her presence was its own offering. The hospital staff encouraged the women to keep journals. Write what you remember. Write what you feel, one doctor said, not realizing that feeling had been a forbidden practice for so long. Still, Ilse wrote about the field where she once ran, and how impossible running now seemed. Greta wrote about white light bursting into darkness. Margot wrote about silence and how silence was sometimes the loudest thing. Lenny wrote prayers, though she did not know if they were heard. As months passed, the women developed something resembling community. Not friendship exactly, not loyalty in the old sense, but connection. In those moments, they felt like themselves again. A soldier holding a door for Greta without hesitation, a doctor explaining a treatment plan without raising his voice. These gestures accumulated like water wearing down stone, subtle, steady, transformative. The women felt themselves slowly unmoored from the certainty of the world they had left behind. Still, not everyone welcomed them. Some townspeople believed the prisoners did not deserve care. A few soldiers muttered under their breath when passing. In the local newspaper, a letter appeared criticizing the resources spent on enemy women while our own return in coffins. The grief was real. The anger was real. Kindness did not erase loss, yet the hospital staff continued their routines. They did not defend the women with speeches or moral declarations. They simply showed up each day and worked. Greta began helping set tables for meals, adjusting placements, and wiping down surfaces. Her movements were slow but deliberate. One nurse commented that she was reliable. The word struck her like a bell. Reliable. Useful not because of ideology, but because of action. She had not felt that since before the sky turned to fire. Margot asked for work in the linen room, folding sheets with crisp edges. She found satisfaction in the rhythm of it. She found her mind quieting for the first time in years. Lenny volunteered to help in the chapel, sweeping aisles and dusting benches. She learned that caring for a space could be a form of prayer even without spoken words. Ilse progressed from the cane to slower, steadier walking. One morning she took 4 steps unaided before her knee trembled. June, the nurse, smiled, not triumphant but proud in a soft human way. Ilse felt the warmth of that recognition pulse through her like sunlight. She realized she had begun to trust this woman, not as an American, not as a captor, but as a fellow person trying to lessen pain in the world. The realization frightened her. Healing was changing them, and change meant the lives they once knew were slipping away. To accept kindness was to accept that the truths they had been taught were incomplete, or perhaps deeply flawed. That was harder to face than any wound. One evening, as winter gave way to early spring, the women sat together on a bench outside the ward. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of tangerine and violet. The air was cool but not harsh. The world felt momentarily still. Lenny spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they are not who we were told they were," she said, "then who are we?" The question lingered like smoke. None of them answered. Inside, a radio crackled alive, broadcasting news in crisp American English. A voice delivered a message the world had been waiting for. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The women sat frozen, the sky darkening around them. The world they belonged to was gone, and whatever awaited them next was something entirely new. Morning came the next day with no celebration. The news of Germany's surrender had arrived not like a triumphant finale, but like a quiet door closing somewhere deep inside the hospital walls. The radio announcement had been brief, clipped, almost clinical, yet the silence that followed stretched long and heavy. For Ilse, Greta, Margot, and Lenny, the war had ended, but its ending did not feel like release. It felt like being unmoored from the shore of a life they had once assumed was permanent. In the ward, some of the American soldiers cheered softly, relieved that perhaps they might return home sooner. Others stared at nothing, thinking of friends who would never see the world after peace. And the German women felt something far more complicated. They were the defeated, yes, but they were also witnesses to something that did not match the world they had been told existed. The enemy had treated them with care, and now that the war was over, the question became what to do with that knowledge. Repatriation did not happen immediately. It would take months, then a year, then more for some. The paperwork was slow. They shared tasks, stories, and sometimes simple companionship in the quiet evenings on the bench outside the ward. The war had once given them identity. Now the absence of war forced them to create one on their own. When the time for repatriation finally came, it was announced without fanfare. A list was posted, names called, schedules arranged. The women packed their few belongings, a shawl, a journal, a photograph, a carved wooden cross from the chapel. They were to be returned to Germany, to whatever remained of their homes. The morning of departure arrived with a cold wind sweeping across the hospital yard. The American staff gathered near the transport trucks. Some offered handshakes, some offered quiet nods, a few offered tears. June embraced Ilse, carefully avoiding pressure on her injured leg. The chaplain blessed Lenny. Greta took one last deep breath of the clean, open air. Margot stood very still, the weight of parting pressing hard against her ribs. It was not only Germany they were returning to. It was the selves they had been before the war revealed itself to be something very different from what they were taught. The ride to the port was silent. Each woman faced not the fear of the unknown now, but the fear of returning to what was once known. What if they no longer belonged there? What if the war had hollowed out not only cities but entire lives? The ship back to Europe was smaller than the one that had carried them to America. The ocean crossing was quieter. No storm, no sickness, only a vast stretch of water and the heavy knowledge that peace was not the same as restoration. When they arrived, Germany was unrecognizable. Cities still smoldered, roads were fractured. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the gray horizon. People moved with the slow, stunned gait of those trying to rebuild life from memory alone. The four women traveled together as far as they could before splitting to find their families. Ilse returned to a town missing half its houses. Her parents embraced her, but she could see in their eyes the shadow of everything lost. Greta found her mother alive, but aged beyond her years. Margot's family home was gone, replaced by rubble. Lenny's village chapel still stood, though the bells were silent now. And yet in the ruins, something surprising happened. The women found themselves becoming caretakers in a land desperate for healing. Ilse helped establish a small clinic. Greta began teaching children to read despite her limited sight. Margot worked distributing ration supplies. Lenny helped repair the chapel and sang again, her voice quiet but steady. They had been shaped by war, but now they chose to shape peace. Years later, one of them, Ilse, would board a ship once more, this time not as a prisoner but as an immigrant. She would return to the country where her belief in enemies had first begun to unravel. She would carry with her the memory of a nurse offering her arm with no hesitation. Because the war had ended, but what began afterward was something far more difficult and far more beautiful. The long work of learning to see each other as human again. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.